Hi everyone, James here, the Vinyl Professor, welcoming you to another video. Hello to subscribers old and new, and to all my friends in the vinyl community, YouTube and beyond. This is going to be a sequel video to one that I posted a couple of weeks ago. I started a thread all about albums from the 80s which had been compromised slightly by a naff 80s production. A fair few people jumped on it and did some fantastic responses. I'd like to thank everybody who did and everybody who contributed and commented. This is also sort of answering a request from the media preacher Michael B. Gallagher. Check him out if you haven't already. He has a wonderful channel in which he talks about music and films and other things, and he plays the piano and is a very nice, clever, all-round guy. He did a response to my video, and then he threw down the gauntlet at the end. He said, okay, well, if these are albums which, could have been great had they not suffered from 80s production, what are the great 80s albums that did not suffer unduly with an 80s production? So I thought, right, let's do a response to this. And my first thought was to maybe only look at maybe 4 or 5 albums. I went round the houses a little bit, and then I decided, no, let's just go for it. Let's show, a lot of records. So I've got something like 26 albums to show you. So I'm not going to spend much time on each one. Don't want this video to be too long. I will just prologue what I'm going to say with 2 main things. My point was not that 80s production ruined a lot of records, although it did do that to some. What I was aiming to talk about really was records where the quality of the songs or the sound had been in some way compromised, by 80s production. That's why I used the word suffered rather than ruined. I didn't want to suggest that those records had been ruined. I don't think they had been. Some people did actually show records that had been ruined. If you didn't see Brian's video, Shamrock, check that one out. That was really funny. But I did want to mention records where you almost wished that it had been produced in another era, because the presets on the keyboards and the way the guitars and the drums have been produced and so on. Often it was a case of artists who'd been around for a long time and they were kind of trying to drag themselves into the 80s, and they'd clearly invested in a couple of synthesizers, like perhaps a Yamaha or a Roland D50, and they'd kind of worked out the presets, and they were kind of going, oh great, we don't need to have brass sections anymore, we don't need to do this, we don't need to do that, we can just set one of these machines going. And so what I'm going to talk about today, there's kind of like 2 or 3 strands that I'm kind of wanting to talk about. In the 80s, you had bands and artists who sort of turned their backs on all that and just completely ignored it and just decided to just plough their own furrow. Or sometimes they would attempt to do kind of 80s style work, and then they would retreat from that and they would try to go back to the sound that they had before. Then there were also artists who managed to play the game successfully. They were able to use the technology and make 80s style records, but they were able to restrain themselves and they were able to keep it in check. They found a way of backgrounding the 80s stuff just enough. It was there in the background to appeal to modern listeners, but it was in the background. It was tasteful. They didn't allow it to become the be-all and end-all of their sound, like so many artists did. Then there's the category of artists who came up in the 80s, or they came up in the very late 70s, went into the 80s, and they were actually pioneers in some way. They understood the technology. They weren't just people who bought a keyboard and were using the presets. They were possibly people who built their own synthesizers. Thinking about people like the Human League. They possibly built their own synthesizers, or they certainly had approached it with a very intelligent, artistic frame of mind, and they were trying to do something genuinely new and innovating. So even though what you get on those records is a very, very 80s sound, in a strange way it still sounds timeless. In a way it still sounds 80s, but it doesn't sound naff 80s. People worked out they could base their music around these new instruments and do something quite visionary. Some people did it, I think, with great vision and ended up producing really, really tremendous albums, using that sound. Anyway, that's enough of a preamble. I'm going to go through it year by year. I think I've got 26 records. Like I said, I'm not going to spend too long. Let's start with 1980. So Kate Bush obviously is somebody who came up at the end of the 1970s. She was not going to suddenly jump into making crap 80s sounding music, and her album Never Forever features such marvellous songs as Babushka and, you know, The Wedding List and so on. It sort of could have been a 1970s record. So there we have the first one, Kate Bush and Never Forever. Then also from 1980 we have the Human League. Now I was going to show this one, and then I realised that was 1979. So the Human League absolutely fall into that category of visionary artists who are ahead of their time. They'd absorbed the lessons of Kraftwerk and so on. You know, let's make records that don't have any instruments on. It's just people pressing buttons and pressing keys on keyboards. There we go. They had a very poppy thing going on later in their career, which often makes people forget how original they sounded when they first came along. You know, very chilly electronica, but quite visionary in its way. So there we have the album Travelogue on Virgin. That was from 1980. Then you have the Talking Heads, which I didn't realise was quite so early. I thought this was a bit later. If you'd have asked me when did this record came out, I would probably have said 83, but no, it was 1980, their third album, possibly. The one they did with Brian Eno, Remaining Light, incredibly innovative sound. It was the one where they used lots of, you know, chopped up bits and pieces. The band were almost sidelined, really. It became a Brian Eno and David Byrne production. Very, very original. Hasn't really dated. You know, songs like Once in a Lifetime, they are of their era, but they're also timeless. So that was 1980. Then we move on to 1981. So we have artists such as the Rolling Stones, who would make increasingly poor records as the 80s went on, but not necessarily because they were buying into the 80s thing. By the time they got to Dirty Work in 87, their sound had definitely been compromised by the 80s. But this record, Tattoo You, was them leaping out of the gate at the start of the 80s with quite a fresh sound. It was produced by Chris Kimsey, who'd been working with them since Sticky Fingers. So they were kind of still connecting back. It had a bright, well EQ'd 80s sound to it, but it's a good sounding record. You know, it's not compromised, it doesn't suffer. I showed this recently in a video, Altered Images. This was also from 1981. This is their first album, produced by Steve Severin of Susie and the Banshees, and a bit like the Human League, it has that kind of post-punk sound to it. It is of its era, but there's no sounds on this that make you wince. You know, it's quite original sounding, quite idiosyncratic, quite original, and a nice sounding record for its time. Then, as a complete contrast, also from 1981, we have the album Discipline from King Crimson, which was them completely reinventing themselves. Bill Bruford had the electronic percussion, he was using a Simmons kit. There's lots of very metallic sounding 80s, almost sort of electro-ethnic sounds on this record. But what a tremendous album. It still sounds absolutely amazing. It was crafted, it was chiseled, you know, the sound was very, very well thought through as a record. You know, there's nothing bad 80s about this at all. It's a very 80s album, but it's definitely not bad 80s. Then another complete towering classic, Non-Stop Erotic Cabaret by Soft Cell from 1981. A bit like the Human League, they were a band who seized the opportunities, understood the technology, knew that it wasn't about having dodgy presets in the background, it was about basing their music around these new sounds and these new technologies, and they created a wonderfully kind of seedy, appropriately kind of red light ambience, I suppose, you know, for this record. Chilly sounding electronica, but done in a pop way. And also they were really building on the disco sound of the late 1970s, or the mid 1970s even. This is one thing I forgot to say in my intro. A lot of people, maybe of a certain generation, but also other people as well, didn't like disco back in the 70s. And what you tend to find is those people also tend not to like a lot of 80s music. And there'll be people who you know, watch these videos who will completely dismiss these kind of records because they basically enjoy acoustic sounds, you know, which is completely fair enough. You know, people have different tastes, but certainly Soft Cell, they built on the disco thing from the 70s when disco started to become a bit more sequenced and there's a lot of disco influences on this record. And of course it kind of paves the way a little bit later for house music. You know, you've got disco, you've got electro sounding pop music, then you've got house music a bit later on, so it's kind of a continuum really. Depeche Mode, this record came out at the end of 1981, and this was produced by Daniel Miller from Meat Records, who was another great innovator. He understood the technology. I think, did he build his own synths? I can't remember, but he certainly was very embroiled in that scene. There was no way he was going to be pressing nice easy presets on digital keyboards. He was going to be doing something original. Depeche Mode were dismissed at the time. People called it, you know, the toy shop department. I think Bill Bruford from Yes and from King Crimson was very, very dismissive of them, but it still stands up today for some people. Okay, so moving into 1982, a couple of records by bands that didn't really buy into the kind of push-button 80s thing. We have Madness at the Rise and Fall, which is just a great sounding album from the early 1980s. You won't find any dodgy presets on this record. It's just, you know, saxes and guitars and pianos and just all the good old stuff. Great album. And then from Down Under you have Cargo, Men at Work. I thought I'd show this one rather than the other one that everybody always shows, because I'm quite fond of this record. They made really good sounding records. There was nothing you know, wince-worthy about these albums, so that's a nice sounding one from 1982. Now we have possibly the first truly great sounding record that I've showed from the 1980s. Let me just check. Yes, it is from 1982. This is possibly one of the greatest sounding albums in my whole collection. This is The Blue Mask by Lou Reed. This sounds absolutely tremendous. I mean, Lou did some great work in the 80s. You know, he didn't go down. I'm not sure if he maybe he did do some other albums that were a bit, you know, dodgy 1980s, but this is definitely not one of them. It just sounds fantastic. Produced by Lou Reed and Sean Fullen. It just has a wonderful, warm, inviting sound. His voice is really well produced on it. The guitars sound incredible, you know, on songs like The Gun and The Blue Mask, you know, a really top sounding record that. And again, that was from 1982. And the next one I'm going to show, also from 82, also sounds absolutely tremendous. I played this the other night, and that is Combat Rock by The Clash. The snare drum sound on this is just the greatest, you know. It is starting to sound like the 80s, that's kind of snare drum sound. It's very bright, you know. It's been worked on in the studio, but it's a really vibey sounding record. Very, you know, it's just a great rock album. It's not compromised, it does not suffer. Just a brilliant sounding record. It has quite a lot of kind of dub influences and, you know, Jamaican influences, lots of space between the instruments and so on. It's been well thought through, you know. It's been well designed as a kind of statement of sound. How pretentious does that sound? And then finally, from 1982, this is an example of what I was talking about before, records where the producer totally understands the technology inside out. Trevor Horn in this case, he completely understands what to do. He has a picture in his mind. He bases the songs and the arrangements around the technology, does it in a way which is quite over the top. Trevor Horn, more than anybody, managed to make very over the top 80s records which still are absolutely brilliant. Again, there'll be some people watching this who will just completely dismiss these kind of records out of hand, but this is as visionary in its way as, you know, any music from the 60s and 70s. It has a sensibility which is completely cohesive, you know, the sounds and the way it's put together and the way the arrangements and the sounds and the songs all merge together. It just sounds absolutely wonderful. ABC, produced by Trevor Horn, not the last time I'm going to hear his name mentioned in this video. And we're still only on 1982. Let's speed up. Okay, so 83, an example of an artist who, again, he may well have made some dodgy records as the 80s progressed. I'm not entirely certain, but this is a really nice one from Richard Thompson. Hand of Kindness has a very rootsy, pleasant sound to it. There's accordions on here. The guitars are absolutely fine. Nothing wrong with that at all. Marvellous. This is an album which often gets kind of swept under the carpet of history. Produced by AC/DC themselves in 1983. It kind of returned them to a very hard basic sound after what Mutt Lange had done on Back in Black and For Those About to Rock. The album makes no concessions to the 80s at all. It sounds very brutal, very not harsh sounding, but it's quite primeval. There are fans of this record now. People have come to recognise it and give it its due. Later on in the decade, their guitar sound will become increasingly thin and unsatisfying, but at this stage they were still rocking. Okay, I was talking before about bands that were influenced by the disco music that came before them, and then in turn went on to influence the house music which came after them. New Order, classic example. Power, Corruption and Lies, one of their kind of early works. It has a very chilled out ambience, very cool sounding synths and drums. Nothing on there that's going to make you wince or go, ooh, what's that nasty preset? Again, I think New Order were visionaries in a sense. They were completely au fait with the technology. They understood exactly what they were doing, and the way they made that transition from the post-punk music of Joy Division into the much more electronic pop world of New Order was really clever, and it paid them back in spades, really. Okay, and then another record by a band that had been around for a while, but which they decided to just stay true, The Pretenders, Learning to Crawl, a phenomenal sounding record. Their version of Thin Line Between Love and Hate is just one of the greatest sounding records of the 80s. Pretenders. This one is one of my favourite albums of all time. This is The, which I had a memory of it being quite a drum machiney album, but there are actually drummers on this record. There's a lot of real instruments, Jules Holland plays piano on it. There's a very visceral sound to it. It's very original sounding. There's no concessions to dodgy 80s crap. He just, he really goes for it. He creates these songs, he creates a mood, he creates a certain, there's a certain psychology behind the songs. There's a very hard, angsty thing going on in the lyrics, and he crafts something which is utterly perfect and it really still sounds fresh to this day. That's The. Moving into 1984, we have a very fine sounding album from Aztec Camera, The Knife. This does have a couple of moments on where you think, okay, that sound could have been a little bit better. A couple of the keyboard sounds are perhaps a little bit cheesy, but generally speaking, that's a very fresh sounding record. Now the next one is possibly the Sistine Chapel of 80s pop. This is Welcome to the Pleasure Dome by Frankie Goes to Hollywood, produced by Trevor Horn again. Some people won't like this album, but this is possibly the purest expression of just totally, overarching 80s wonderland. It's the great, huge sonic cathedral of the 1980s, totally overwhelming in its grandiosity, but the sounds really come together. There's nothing cheesy about it. It just it totally exists on its own terms and in its own world, and it was consciously created as a kind of totally whiz bang wallop album, which really summed up what was now possible to do in a recording studio. Trevor Horn was never going to be looking back. He was always going to be saying, right, look what we can do now. And this, in its way, is an absolutely tremendous sounding record. Okay, and finally from 84, Talk Talk did a lot of great work in the 80s. This is their album It's My Life, which, you are definitely starting to hear an 80s sound now. 80s music, rock music or whatever, was often a bit boomy, a little bit clattery. So I'm not going to deny, you can now definitely hear we are into the 80s, but this record it really does still sound great to me. Talk Talk. Then moving into 1985, we have another artist from the old days who decided just to completely turn his back on it all. Tom Waits and Rein Dogs has just a really original sound to it. It has all the kind of weird percussion instruments that sound like somebody's beating on, human skulls and so on. I don't think you're going to find a Yamaha or a Roland D50 on here. Very kind of classic sounding album from the 80s. And this next one, also from 85, a little bit like Frankie, Scritti Politi's Cupid in Psyche. It just is the most airbrushed 80s sound that you can imagine. And with one or two exceptions, it still sounds marvellous. There are some quite nasty brass stabs on this record, but a bit like the Frankie album, a bit like ABC, a bit like New Order, a bit like Human League, it's completely unapologetic. It does not try to be something that it's not. It uses the technology again and tries to make something which it's like ear candy. It's just great on the ears. It sounds fantastic still, I think. And Green Gartside is a complete genius in my opinion. Wonderful record. Okay, so we're moving on. So this one, To Make Headley Jealous, Elvis Costello from 1986, King of America. Now I think I'm right in thinking the previous album to this had been a little bit 1980s, or quite a lot 1980s. I think somebody talked about it in one of the videos. Maybe it was Jeff Party. And then this one, he decided to kind of, roll that back, work with T-Bone Burnett and make something much more rootsy, something which was not going to get in the way of the songs, and, hey presto, one of Elvis's greatest albums, King of America. Where would the 80s be without mentioning the Smiths? Now the Smiths did have an 80s sound. I do find some of their records not as nice to listen to as they could. Sometimes the drums are a little bit thin and unsatisfying, but in general you can't really argue with the Smiths. There's no way you could say, oh yeah, the Smiths made bad 80s sounding music. Clearly they did not. And then moving on to 1987, only one record to show you. This is one I just pulled out as just a perfectly nice sounding record. Produced by Ian Stanley, who oddly enough had previously been a member of Tears for Fears, but he doesn't allow that to get in the way here. This is a fairly acoustic sounding record. It's got some nice guitar sounds, the drum kit sounds perfectly okay. I don't detect any nasty sounding keyboards on this. So this is Lloyd Cole and the Commotions, Mainstream from 87. Then moving on to 1988. So we're definitely into the era now of big, boomy 80s rock, alternative rock, indie rock, This is produced by John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin. This is Children by The Mission. Even though it has that 80s sound, think Simple Minds, think U2 and so on, it doesn't compromise the music, it doesn't make the songs suffer. It's just an album from that time, and it still sounds good, John Paul Jones is behind the controls. It has a bit of a kind of Zeppelin ambience, updated for the 80s, and it sounds great, that one. Bit of a contrast, Everything But the Girl, also from 1988, just a nice sounding pop album. There are some slightly dodgy sounds on this. There's quite a nasty sounding drum sound on one of the tracks, and there are some presets on this record, but to me they're done tastefully. You can listen to this album and not wince and go, ooh, if only this had been recorded in 1978. Often it's the material as well that kind of carries these things through. You can forgive certain things if the songs are really good, if the performances are great, if the vocals are appealing, if the lyrics are marvellous, and Everything But the Girl just did some really well accomplished pop music. Now I wanted to show this one from 1989 because I'd showed Cozy Fan Tutti Frutti from 1983 or 4. It was a Squeeze album where they'd just gone completely over the top with just ridiculous 80s production. I mean, I do like that album. This album they recorded in 1989 with E.C. Thorngren, and it's one of the most timeless records they ever did. It was just after they'd recorded Babylon and On, which was a big hit album, but it had featured some quite nasty sounding 80s keyboards. This one, they just went into quite a cheap recording studio, didn't mess about. There's nothing on this that's going to make you wince. There's no dodgy keyboards, there's no synths, there's I think there's a Hammond organ or a Farfisa organ or something, there's piano, the drums sound great, there's guitars, there's some accordion. Just a really nice, warm sounding record from Squeeze. That's Frank. And then also from 89 we have The Wedding Present and Bizarro. Very dry, scratchy sound on the guitars. Nothing wrong with this whatsoever. Definitely an 80s album, but a really good sounding one, very original, very just doing their own thing, crafting their own sound, not relying on presets, not trying to get in the charts, just classic British indie. And finally, to finish up with another great sounding Lou Reed album from 1989. This is New York, produced interestingly by Fred Maher, who had formerly been a member of Scritti Politti, and a bit like the Blue Mask, this record sounds fantastic. The guitar sounds on it are all very in your face, very visceral. The drums sound great. His voice just, it's kind of really forward in the mix, but it's really well produced. It's got that deep tactile quality to it. There were some dreadful vocal production touches in the 80s where everything became sort of in the background, very boomy with the drums in the foreground, but this record just does not do anything remotely like that. It could have been produced in the 70s in a way, and it still sounds very, very timeless. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you to Michael B. Gallagher, the media preacher, for offering me the opportunity to do that. Thank you again to everybody who watched my original video. Of course, I will now be inviting you to show your own records that sound great from the 80s, that did not suffer from an 80s production, and I look forward to seeing those and to reading comments and replying as ever. Thank you, VC. I will see you very soon. Christmas is on its way.